So basically, I'm here to talk about the motion to introduce rationing of certain things, which we tried to bring to the autumn conference, but mostly it didn't get debated. And one of the things which is very difficult with Green Party policy is that when you go to conference, you have 3 minutes to describe your motion and defend it, and or propose it, I should say, and then you have usually 1 minute after a fairly brief discussion to sum up, and then there's a vote. So it's a very, very little time to try to persuade people, and it's also quite difficult to kind of campaign within the party. So it seems a good idea for us to reach out across borders and try to meet with other parties. And thank you very much for agreeing to meet with us, because you know, it's not always that easy to do that. So to begin with this rationing question, I think it's useful just to look at the background of where the Green Party is with things at the moment. So the party decided at a conference in 2018 that it wanted its policies to be designed in such a way as to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And then it set up its climate emergency policy working group to review the party's policies to ensure that this goal was met. And one of the things which the party has done is to adopt the idea that we'll take responsibility not only for our domestic emissions, but also for emissions embodied in airports, shipping and aviation. Sorry, in imports, I should have said, shipping and aviation. And of course, the present government, I think, still doesn't accept the idea that we should be doing that. So when they talk about reducing our emissions by a certain percentage, they're leaving all that out of account. You know, the Green Party has lots of very rich policies on just about everything, really, and it has policies on transport, which seek to reduce people's reliance on the private car, and which seek to reduce flights. Their policies seek to reduce car travel by various means, including reducing the need for travel by going for a more local kind of agenda, by encouraging walking, cycling, public transport, and so on. However, when it comes to reducing carbon-heavy consumption, the party relies rather heavily on taxation, really, as a way of trying to do that. So, in principle, the party believes in taxation and dividend. So the idea, given that taxation is likely to be unpopular, the idea of taxation and dividend is that you raise a tax on your high carbon, on the sales of high carbon goods, and then you redistribute quite a large proportion of the money on a per capita basis so that it becomes a redistributive tax. All of which implies, of course, that high carbon goods are still being bought. And the policy is, I think, quite old. So I think that as people in just the last few years, and I do think there's been an enormous change in just the last few years, have started to realize just how serious the situation is with the climate. I think this policy, which is well designed for nudging changes in behavior, is beginning to seem as if it might not be effective enough. The other policy which exists at the moment is that in the last general election, the party proposed a frequent flyer levy. And the idea of the levy is that everybody could fly once a year without paying the extra levy. But after that, they would have to pay some substantial amount extra. So it can be argued that this would make quite a big proportionate reduction in flights. But on the other hand, the idea that everybody could fly once a year is quite a long way from being zero carbon as well, seeing that aviation is such a very high carbon good, so to speak. Now, one thing that has changed since we introduced this, since we started to work on this motion, is that the Autumn Conference agreed a policy that all private and diesel cars should be off the road by 2030. So that's our policy, and I haven't heard much discussion of that in the public realm, because I suppose that it's something that that might get quite a strong response at some point or another. So the party has committed itself to getting to net zero, including carbon arising from imports, aviation and shipping, but it's questionable whether the policies are still strong enough to do that. And certainly the Climate Emergency Working Group, having done an enormous amount of work actually reviewing all the policies and trying to work out how much emission reduction would be achieved by each one, came to the conclusion in 2019 and informed the conference in 2019 that that goal wasn't yet being achieved. So we needed to still find further policies. The other thing well, two other things, I suppose, that I want to raise here in general, which is not so much about the Green Party, but about the attitude of the Green movement in general, first of all, is that I think it's long been accepted by Greens in general that we needed to have contraction and convergence. In other words, that developed societies, which are massively overusing the world's resources and emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases, needed to make very large reductions in their resource use and their greenhouse gas emissions, in order that developing societies would be able to use more resources and emit more in the course of catching up. So it's very, very much a kind of equalitarian agenda, and it does imply, it's another reason why we ought to be trying to reduce our emissions and some of our resource use. And I think in the last few years, we have seen that the climate crisis has been escalating, and people are becoming more aware of that, and climate scientists are becoming more outspoken about it because they're seeing much worse evidence than they expected 20 years ago. We have seen that positive feedbacks have been triggered in the climate system, resulting in more warming. So the loss of ice in the Arctic has eliminated, or greatly reduced anyway, the albedo effect, leading to further warming and further loss of ice. That we see carbon dioxide and methane emissions coming from the defrosting tundra and from the warmed Arctic Ocean, which contains stocks of methane clathrates. And we see that increasing carbon dioxide is being emitted by warmer soils as the biological activity in the soils picks up, and we see increasing methane emissions from tropical wetlands, as well as carbon emissions from wildfires that are completely increasingly out of control, and of course extreme weather and so on. And sadly, we see that equatorial and tropical forests are suffering partly, well, quite a lot, admittedly, from direct human intervention to cut them down and convert the land for use in pasture or fodder crops or palm oil or whatever, but also they are being damaged by the irregularity of the weather and droughts, which now happen more frequently and more severely than they used to do, so that tropical and equatorial forests, which used to capture a great deal of carbon, are capturing less, and some parts of the Amazon are now giving out more carbon dioxide than they capture. So there is an urgency, and we see this urgency in the emergence of movements like Extinction Rebellion, the school strike, and so on. So turning to the specific motion, which is just one small thing, but maybe not quite such a small thing, because this is a motion that calls on which would require, not call on, but require quite substantial changes in behaviour. The original motion that we put together and sought to bring to the autumn conference was designed to introduce the principle of rationing into the climate emergency policy, and then to apply it to the food and agriculture policy and to the transport policy. So in the food and agriculture policy, the proposal was to ration meat and dairy foods. And in the transport policy, the proposal was to aim to largely eliminate leisure flying, with wriggle room for some kind of allowance for leisure flying for people who have families in other parts of the world. But it would envisage a very large change there. And in relation to the use of petrol and diesel, it calls for rationing of petrol and diesel with a view to phasing them out by 2030, because there's going to be no possibility of using petrol and diesel at scale if we're going to be zero carbon, or net zero carbon. And the motion then, again leaves some wriggle room for thinking about specific needs. And obviously you would have to think about the needs of people in rural populations, or the people with jobs that are difficult to get to, or people with mobility problems and so on. But the details aren't spelled out in the motion, because that's too much detail for policy, and so that those details would have to be worked out by a parliament that would enact a measure of that sort. Now, then what actually happened was that because the party had asked the Food and Agriculture Working Group to produce a new policy, and that new policy was to be approved, Standing Orders Committee took the food and agriculture relevant parts of this and put it in as an amendment to the food and agriculture policy. For that reason, it did get debated. So the food and agriculture policy was debated. The idea of rationing meat and dairy foods was debated very briefly, very quickly kicked out, and the new policy was adopted as it was. It is an improvement on the old policy, but it doesn't do very much about, it doesn't do nearly enough about climate change, to be honest. So the next, the main motion, which was to amend the food and the climate emergency and the climate emergency and transport chapters of our policy. We didn't get to it on the agenda. We were very, very close. It was extremely it was like a cliff edge. I don't know what would have happened though, because I noticed that one very prominent Green managed to speak against it while speaking about a completely different policy. And there's no doubt at all that rationing is controversial in the Green Party for various reasons. And I dare say we might discuss some of them. But yes, so basically we have agreed that we would try to bring it back to the spring conference. For various reasons, I think that's not going to happen, which are really just administrative problems, really, in terms of things not having been done in time, for which I must take responsibility. But that means that I think we will almost certainly be wanting to bring it to the autumn conference. In a way, that's a good thing, because there needs to be an awful lot of discussion about this before it goes back to a conference, because it is controversial. It's just very hit or miss just to take it into a group of a few hundred party members, which is what there will be in a conference realistically, and the vote could go either way really, depending on who happens to be there on the day, I think. But so there's a need to, and that's really why I'm talking to you and why I'm hoping that we will talk to other parties and find other venues. And this weekend there's a presentation in the Policy Fest, for example. But so I think there's a long way to go with this, and there will be a lot of work to do if it were to be accepted. That's kind of what I had planned to say, and maybe we could throw this open to discussion.
If I'd kick it off then, Greg. Obviously, rationing, is going to be very difficult to sell, but you talk about having wriggle room for families abroad or people living in rural areas. Sounds like there'd be a massive bureaucracy in trying to work out, what each person's ration was, because it would depend on their personal circumstances in that case. So that sounds like there'd be a lot of bureaucracy, which would be difficult to do. And then leading on from that, so how do you see that? Leading on from that, could people trade their ration? So if they weren't using it, could they sell it to somebody else?
Yes, this is a problem this is a question which is always raised. And I mean, I think it's very interesting. If you had a saleable ration, then it would, I suppose, since everybody would have the same saleable ration, I suppose it would become in effect a progressive tax. On the other hand, if you do that, then you're bringing the price mechanism that you're trying to eliminate by rationing back into it. So personally, I wouldn't be in favour of that. So the motion doesn't carry any suggestion that it's a tradable ration. Now that, of course, could be something that people might want to take up and make into an amendment, or maybe we should be persuaded to change that. I think though, coming back to what you were saying about the bureaucracy, yes, I completely agree with you. I think it's so much easier to make it a price thing. Governments are totally used to collecting sales taxes. They collect them all the time. It's all there. And then if you think about the sale tax on road fuel, well, we had the road fuel tax escalator. It was abandoned pretty quickly because it was unpopular. And in a way, I think that was right. It's unfair. The same thing happened to Mr. Macron, didn't it? He brought down an even bigger storm of protest on himself when he did the same thing. So then we come to this question, well, what do you do about the administration? And well, I suppose all I can say about that is, well, we've done it before. Well, actually, not so much with road fuel, because if you think about the last time we had rationing in this country, life was not organized around the private car for the vast majority of people in the way that it is today. So that part of it wouldn't have arisen, of course. But nevertheless, in Second World War rationing, thought did have to be given to different people's needs, even for road fuel, for those that did have vehicles. And thought was given to different people's needs for different amounts of food, according to whether they were doing manual work or what, or whether they had health problems. And civil aviation wasn't an issue.
People didn't want to fly anywhere over the continent during the Second World War very often.
It was a bad idea.
If rationing were made tradable, Greg, would that not be an incentive for people to accept it?
Yes, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Maybe it would be an incentive for people to accept it. But although I can't help thinking, I mean, I found myself thinking, okay, so I've got a ration of 2 pounds of beef a year. See, I'm assuming it's a very low ration. And somebody, let's think I'm a fairly poor person, which I'm not really, But let's suppose I'm a fairly poor person, I've got this ration and I'm thinking, okay, well, actually, I need more food to feed my family, and I will sell this ration for something, and I will buy a lot of pork sausages or something. I don't know. Although I can see you might think that it's, in a way, I can see that it might make it acceptable. In another way, I find it sticks in my throat rather. You know, because in a sense, I think the other side of this question is, well, maybe people are really, you know, because actually, if you think about saying we're going to go to zero, you're saying really no meat, no dairy food scarcely. I mean, I can see there might be an argument for a little. You're really saying no aviation, and you're definitely saying no petrol and diesel. To say net zero is easy. To say what that really means, that's not easy.
Right.
And I think that if people are going to accept that, it's going to be on the basis that they experience it as fair. I think, and I'm not sure. You know, I'm just not sure that. I mean, you can argue it either way, but I'm just not sure that if it's tradable, because you know, I also thought, this is a bit off the top of my head now, but I was thinking about council houses. People were persuaded to buy their council houses, weren't they? And they don't own them now because poor people can't hold on to their assets. You know, a lot of them now belong to landowners, to landlords, don't they? Yeah. Poor people can't hold on to their assets, and you know, in a sense, that's the sort of problem about a saleable ration. You'd be forced to give it up. Well, I wouldn't be, but a lot of people would be.
I mean, I think that the alternative to this, realistically, what we're looking at is levy and taxes. And essentially, that would happen under that regime anyway, where people with less money will be disproportionately affected and will be forced to give up those goods while the wealthy still had them. And that's almost a parallel, isn't it, there, where the poor people are giving something up. But at least, I suppose, under some sort of trading scheme, there is some financial advantage there, or you know, some sort of incentive. And at the moment, there's kind of very little in between those two, isn't there? So it's a lesser of an evil. But I totally understand what you're saying, Greg, in that it doesn't feel right, does it? Because you still have that problem of inequality, no matter what, which I think is what we'd like to avoid whilst having environmental integrity. And it's very difficult. But for me, rationing is, when it comes down to it, that's possibly the only way we can at least attempt to do that.
And thinking about car travel, private car travel, I mean, one of the problems in relation to inequality is that if you have, say, one person, somebody with even with a fairly efficient, relatively low carbon petrol car that they need for work and travel, and they will be rationed, while somebody with considerably more resources who can buy an electric car will be exempt from rationing purely because they've been able to buy a far more expensive resource than a person whose their car may be doing 50, 60 miles a gallon, but you know they desperately need it to get to, you know. Now, obviously, if there's good alternatives, public transport or whatever, then the rationing, if the rationing is for leisure and alternative uses, then it's fine. Just have this difficulty that there are far too many people who would be relatively low income who would actually be hit by this disproportionately.
Yes, no, I quite see your point, and that's a very good point, Tom. And I hadn't thought about this, because you're quite right. And I think we have a huge problem with cars, really. And the Green Party wants people to be less dependent on cars, but we haven't really, you know, we've got some ideas about how to make that happen, but it's very much based on voluntarism, really. And if we want people to have cars at all, then we want them to have electric cars. So we're trying to get to a point where there are fewer cars, they're electric, and they're kind of owned in a different way. So that, you know, they belong to car clubs or something. And I suppose if you live out in the wilds of the Scottish Highlands, you definitely have one of your own. But of course, electric cars are really expensive, and the poorest people do depend on the worst petrol and diesel driven cars, don't they? I mean, old ones, because that's what they do. I mean, or they don't have one at all. And this proposal doesn't really do anything about any of that. It's quite true, yes. What it does do is it's designed to help to get people into a mindset where instead of driving the petrol driven car until 2030 and then having it scrapped without having worked out anything different and without having reduced their emissions in the meantime, they find themselves under pressure to drive less because they've got a downward pressure on the availability of fuel. And so that is about changing behavior and reducing emissions. The overall problem of the unfairness about mobility and the costs of transferring over to electric cars, I would say this proposal doesn't address that, and I wouldn't say the party yet is trying to address that either.
I think one of the things we want to achieve is not one electric car for one petrol car. We want to see more by way of car sharing and co-housing and sharing of resources and more environmental planning and more environmental living, which actually also complicates to some extent it doesn't make it impossible, but complicates the rationing, because the rations would have to be subdivided between people who work on car shares and co-housing schemes and all the various environmental things. And of course, if we're going to do like a carbon type of rationing, that could that could come also not just to transport, but to things like home heating and so on. And so I think the rationing may have a role, but it can only come after there is sufficient sort of government input into the right infrastructure, whether it is in home insulation or public transport or or subsidizing electric vehicles.
Yes.
So it can be right, but there has to be first something of a change in the availability of resources,
yes,
and the infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, obviously they need to go in parallel, and certainly the Green Party's policy is about developing public transport and these other things, and so they do have to be thought about in parallel. I wondered about domestic heating, but I thought, well, actually that is even more difficult for people to take control of, really. Many people, well, of course, many people don't have control over the house they live in at all anyway, because they don't own it. So I didn't try to progress that idea. But yes, where does one go with this? There is a lacuna in our policy, actually, and it's true that the rationing isn't sufficient in itself. I'll tell you one thing I'm thinking, and this is off the top of my head. I'm thinking that if you've got a car and you're paying for a car, you're going to use it. It's there, it's outside your door. What does it matter if there's a bus? If you've got to walk to a bus stop, you're not going to do that, are you? I mean, unless you're a green or some peculiar person like that, you're not going to walk to a bus stop, you're going to use the car. If you're poor and you're paying money for the car, You're definitely going to use it. You're not going to go and pay bus fares as well.
Well, it's tied in, yeah.
So
It's all very much tied in with the question of inequality and the great divide
yes, it is.
in this country between rich and
Yes. Yes, it's interesting you say that, because I had this session in the Policy Fest, and that came out very strongly with people. You know, we need a policy on inequality.
absolutely, yes.
I don't know how good a policy we do have on inequality, though I suppose we have the idea of the citizen's income, don't we?
Yes.
As well as, I mean, you talk really about rationing the usage of things, but and the debate about, you know, if you've got the electric car, you can afford the electric car, don't we have to ration the things, the cars as well, so that it isn't, you can't just think I'm going to replace my petrol car with the electric car because I can afford it. You know, so it's not just rationing the usage, it's rationing the stuff, and especially if we're going to count imports of stuff to our net zero by 2030. You start there. I mean, that you've then got a problem, because you're slowing down the transfer to electric vehicles from petrol and diesel. But
yes, yes. Well, that is a very interesting thought. Yes, and you know, I don't think we have yet really done very much about thinking about who should or could have a car.
And I just pick up on that, just a point of information, really. How far the government recently, a while back, announced some idea of phasing out the production, is it, of fossil fuel cars by 2030 or whatever. How close is that to Green Party policy? Green Party policy wants to take them all off the road by 2030.
Yeah.
Does the government see them production stopping in 2030, but petrol and diesel fuel cars going on for another 20, 30 years?
Oh, do you know, I'm honestly not sure about the answer to that.
No.
I don't know whether they've announced anything about how long petrol and diesel cars might go on being used. When I think our policy is that they should no longer be sold after 2025.
I agree with that, but obviously we need to persuade the government to
yes,
come along with that.
Yes. There is another side to this whole idea about rationing, as a matter of fact, and that is that it's deliberately intended to draw attention to how difficult the whole thing is.
Yeah.
No, because in a way, I think that there's a danger that we and other, you know, not only politicians in other parties, but in our party too, we kind of drift along with a sense of saying, well, it's all fine, and we're going to just switch over to electric cars. Actually, of course, switching over to electric cars is in itself a hugely carbon intensive undertaking.
Yeah.
And a hugely demanding on resources, so that in terms of carbon emissions and a fair allocation of resources in the world, it's far from clear that replacing 30 something million cars and vans with 30 something million battery operated cars and vans is at all an acceptable policy. But in a sense, I can see that we and other parties might drift into that because we don't want to tell people they can't have a car.
I've certainly rethought mine, so I was all ready to buy an electric car just before COVID and lockdown.
Yeah.
And now I'm thinking, that'd be stupid. It's sat. I'm not using it.
Yeah.
You know, it's sat there. And the embedded carbon, and even if I go back to my sort of normal mileage, which isn't great, the embedded carbon, it's going to take me something like 10 years to pay that back.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a very difficult decision.
Yes. So in a way, what I see as an advantage, which is that this is a policy that we get the Green Party criticised, is seen by many people as a disadvantage. And you know, the advantage is that you do at least get noticed, and you get yourself into a position where you actually have to tell people how serious the situation really is. You know, I say you can't drive and you can't fly and you can't eat meat and dairy, although the meat and dairy has been separated off into a slightly different issue now. We'll have to come back to that another time. But that is really saying to people how serious things are. And you know that so one of the arguments against this is usually, well, you'll make yourselves unelectable. Yeah. And for people who are very committed to target to win, and who are, you know, trying to build up green representation locally, I can see why that makes them anxious. I'm not sure that it should. I think that to present people with an honest account of how bad the situation is might be a good thing to be doing. But I can understand why people who want to get elected are anxious about it.
Yes, I understand that too. Yeah. So I'm with you, Greg. I think we need to tell it as it is.
Yes.
Yeah,
And you know, trying to make excuses for not doing anything is the wrong way to go.
Yes.
I totally agree with you, and I think it's not just that, but I think what we've demonstrated is that softer policy options have been ineffective, and there's no way around that. You know, I think looking at convergence of technology, getting different people talking, incentivizing, there is a huge place for that. And I think that's very important because we need to be as inclusive and as positive in many ways as we can be. But yeah, soft policy thus far has not worked, and we're somewhat running out of time. So even if this just becomes a more central conversation, I think it's quite crucial to try and take this further. And also importantly, I think Greg's policy isn't drawing the line at where rationing sits. You know, you're not specifying here are the units per person or what have you at this point. There's a lot of time for dialogue and sort of that bureaucracy you mentioned earlier later down the line. But yeah, I think getting that dialogue happening is like you say, I think it's really important. And I think that's a Green Party role that we can't underestimate. I think sort of where we go, we might see Labour and Lib Dems follow, even if it's in a slightly watered down approach. And to that extent, I sort of feel it's a little bit our duty to look into things like rationing a bit more seriously.
And how, Greg, do you think we can best take this dialogue forward?
Well, I don't know really. I mean, I'm hoping to go and have this kind of conversation with lots of parties.
Good.
I hope that if people are interested, that they would sort of have you know, it might be possible to bring some more people in your local party into thinking about this. People aren't all going to agree. And I hope that people will come to conferences. I don't know what else really. I mean, there's various changes in the air, aren't there, in the constitutional
in the Green Party constitution, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, in the conference, I mean, if I'm sure you realize, of course, you know, you've got the workshops that look at various motions, and normally you've got what might be called the policy, various policy committees, the policy gurus who lead the workshop, and in a sense there needs to be some kind of preliminary dialogue about what you know, what is it that could make a proposal more acceptable? Yeah, I mean, there's three things can happen to it. One is that it's adopted, one that it's rejected, or one that it is as it were referred, put back, or whatever, for more information. So it might be worth talking to some of those people to say, well, where does this clash with what we're trying to do? What is, you know, what are the extra bits of information that might make it easier to put it to a workshop, to have a workshop supporting it? I mean, I know that Richard Lawson, over the past, whatever it is, 30, 36 years that I've known him, or 34 years, he's had various goes at various motions, some of which were rejected and so on. And then he's sort of battled his way through a couple that got through. And usually it's trying to get under the skin of some of the policy gurus.
Yes, it's obviously helpful if you can get the working group on your side. And I guess I'm not in the transport working group. Perhaps I'd better get into it. But of course, I mean, in reality, I mean, even in the climate emergency working group, there isn't necessarily a consensus about everything. In fact, I think perhaps a consensus in the Green Party is extremely rare. But you know, there are all sorts of things that people have different ideas about. But so look, I mean, I suppose.
The other side of it is, I think we're not quite clear, but the Green Party is kind of has got a whole lot of policies about, you know, what is wrong with and sort of where we want to get to zero carbon 2030. But in terms of carbon, we need to, in terms of transport, we need to have some sort of models of how do we want to see things. So if I look down our cul-de-sac in our large village and where I live and say, right, I don't know, I haven't counted, but suppose there's 40 private cars. Even actually, there is a couple of them are electric, but anyway. And what do I want to see? I don't want to see 40 electric cars. I might want to see 15 charging points, cul-de-sac with 15 cars that we can, you know, that people can hire, rather like bikes, which can be driven to the train station or to a motorway hub where there's an electric bus for a long distance one, or to local. And so we need to have some kind of a model. I'm not being prescriptive about it, but some sort of a model and say, right, from where we are, what are the steps to get to something like that? And where does, at what point, and where does rationing fit into that? Which it might well do.
Yes, okay. I think that's a very helpful thought, because I think that although we have components of those things in the transport policy, it hasn't come together in a way which coherently provides a picture of where we want to get to. You know, the transport policy overall, in relation to which rationing would be just, you know, one, and in fact a transitional policy, because we're not going to have petrol and diesel vehicles on the road, we hope. But in any case, it's our job to predict it, to provide a picture, yes, that people can believe in. Yeah. Okay. Look, I think that's very helpful. What I would quite like to do is to, you know, if there are people who are interested in knowing how this whole thing goes, to have a list of email addresses of anybody who wants to be involved in being informed about what happens with it, you know, because maybe it'll go back to the autumn conference in this form. Maybe something different will come out of it. I don't know, but it would be quite good to be able. I mean, if anybody would like to know, and also if you are going to give this recording to people, perhaps they could also have my email address in case they want to give me any comments on it. Well, look, that's been a very helpful discussion, and thank you for all those thoughts.